Hello and welcome into another episode of Locked on Wolves. Today on the show, we're talking about Jaden McDaniels' injury, who needs to step up for the Wolves, plus how good has Karl-Anthony Towns been defensively, but there's a lot more he could do on offense compared to what he's done in past seasons. The sky really is the limit for this Timberwolves offense as a whole because of that. We'll talk briefly about ESPN's way too early end of season awards and then also previewing Wolves-Sixers, a big showdown at Target Center Wednesday night. It's all upcoming. Welcome in. You are Locked on Wolves.
You are Locked on Timberwolves, your daily Minnesota Timberwolves podcast. Part of the Locked on Podcast Network. Your team every day.
Hello and welcome to the Locked on Wolves podcast, part of the Locked on Podcast Network, your team every day. My name is Ben Beecken. I'm the host of Locked on Wolves. Happy Wednesday, everybody. Happy Hump Day. Happy Thanksgiving Eve. And happy Timberwolves game day. The Wolves host the Sixers tonight in a big showdown of two of the best, 3 or 4 teams in the entire NBA so far this season. We'll talk about that a little bit later in the show. First of all, though, off the top, a big thank you for making Locked on Wolves your first listen every day. Of course, this show is free and available everywhere, including YouTube, as well as all of your favorite audio platforms. Wherever you like to listen to podcasts, you can find this show. You can also watch on the Locked On Sports Minnesota app on both Roku and Amazon Fire TV. And you can follow on X at Locked On T Wolves and also at Beecken with 2 B's, 2 E's, CKEN. All right. We have to start with the Jaden McDaniels news. A little bit of analysis along with this, but really McDaniels is out for the injury is a 3 to 4 week injury, or 2 to 3 week injury. It's an important whole reason we're talking about this. I got to get that right. 2 to 3 week injury. Wolves said in a press release they're going to reevaluate him in a week, undoubtedly to see if he's trending more towards the 2 or the 3 week timeline. So, obvious answer, and we talked about this in today's Minnesota basketball party, which, depending on when you listen to this, will be posted very soon on audio. Otherwise, you could go check it out on the Locked On Sports Minnesota YouTube channel, but it'll be right here on the Locked On Wolves channel. It's the episode following this one in your feed. A much broader conversation among the group of us about who's going to step up. The obvious answer is Alexander Walker, right? He's very likely going to start. I know Chris Finch said after the game the other day, depends on matchups. Could be Kyle Anderson, could be Alexander Walker. Kyle Anderson, the way the Wolves use him, and I agree that it should be matchup dependent, but the way the Wolves use Kyle Anderson, he's much more that straw that stirs the drink, right? He's much more that point forward off the bench, that Swiss Army knife, as Fitch has called him in the past. Alexander Walker is more of a classic role player, and you could plug and play him with virtually any lineup, and his responsibilities are to defend at a high level and to knock down open threes. Yes, I know he has a little bit more to his game, and he's shown a little bit more this year than certainly he did and other stops along the way to get to Minnesota. The best version of Alexander Walker isn't actually putting the ball on the floor, isn't distributing, isn't trying to get to the basket. It's nice that he can do those things, and in a pinch, great. But the best version of Alexander Walker is the version the Wolves would need of him in the starting lineup, which he did the first couple of games this season when the Wolves got off to a mostly good start. When they had Alexander Walker in the starting lineup and they saw him in the lineup in preseason, he fits well with Karl-Anthony Towns, Rudy Goar, Mike Conley, Anthony Edwards. Like he slots in very nicely as a role player. And I think it's going to work well to have him as part of that starting unit and to keep Kyle Anderson on the bench. In this game against Philadelphia, I mean, it's probably that, right? Because that's what I think everybody's most comfortable with, and keeping Kyle Anderson and his well-rounded game on the bench. It's not like you need the biggest trick with the Sixers, of course, is guarding both Tyrese Maxey and Joel Embiid. There's nobody else that's really a high-usage guy that's going to kill you on a night-to-night basis. And some nights it could be Tobias Harris. Some nights it could be DeAnthony Melton. And we'll talk more about this matchup later. But it's really a top-heavy roster, the guys you have to worry about. So, of course, you're going to put Ant on Tyrese Maxey, I think. And hopefully he doesn't get, I guess the concern there is foul trouble, of course. So Alexander Walker may get that assignment to start, but those two guys are going to guard him, right? And the Wolves will probably put Cat on Embiid like what they've done with Jokic. Now, we know that Cat and Embiid have had their, we'll call it, issues in the past. So it'll be interesting to see, especially on the heels of Cat's fourth quarter, I would say, challenges on Monday night when he got called for like 5 fouls in 8 minutes or whatever crazy foul rate that was after doing a really good job of keeping his composure all game long. The Wolves, I think, probably will still risk that because Kat's done so good on Jokic, and he's been, in general, the last, call it 9 months, going back to the end of last season, much more mature and better defensively. We'll talk about this here in a minute. He's been genuinely very good defensively. Karl-Anthony Towns has been. So I'm curious to see what the Wolves' approach is. The Sixers, they're not the way that, well, we'll talk again. I really do want to dig into this matchup later, but I'm trying to kind of parse what this lineup looks like against this team. The Sixers don't shoot a ton of threes, so the Wolves could even mix in a little bit more zone. I know they've started to do that more with Rudy off the floor. Is that a possibility against Maxey and Embiid to try and maybe goad Embiid into shooting some mid-range shots, shooting some, like, I know he's shot the ball well from 3 the last couple of years. He's 32% so far this year. You'd rather have him shooting threes than drawing fouls on Cat or Rudy in the paint. And perhaps even Maxey, right? Like, Maxey shot the ball really well from 3, but to try and turn this team into a jump shooting team from the perimeter because they draw fouls at such a high rate would be great. And Alexander Walker should be a big part of that. So all that to say, Na is the guy who's going to see the biggest minutes increase. The other piece of this is Troy Brown Jr. is very likely going to slide into that, everybody bumps up a rung on the ladder, right? The rotation. So I think that's Troy Brown Jr. It will be Troy Brown Jr. very likely being the 9th man. There could be opportunity for Josh Minott, depending on how Troy Brown Jr. does and also where this team is struggling. If this team struggles to rebound, and the Sixers are a team that rebounds really well, could we see, at least on the offensive glass, could we see Josh Minott sliding into some of those 9th man minutes, we'll call it? Now, Minott's more a 4 than he is a 3, and just that's the natural fit why Alexander Walker and Troy Brown Jr., who are both more natural wings, really 3s. Alexander Walker 2/3 and Brown more of a 3. So there's a natural kind of backfill there, but depending on how everybody's performing, this could be Josh Minott's window as a big 3, or as a 4, depending on, and also Naz has struggled a little bit the last couple of games. I'm not at all suggesting Minott should get Naz's minutes, but if there's a matchup where the Wolves are struggling on the glass and Naz isn't providing a whole lot offensively, that's always a possibility too. And I don't think that would be a long-term solution by any means, but Chris Finch is going to want to find a way to get Josh Minott minutes. And we saw this immediately when he came into the game the other night. He caught an alley-oop, he grabbed a couple of boards in garbage time. Like, that's what Minott does. And this is actually a matchup where that energy and that physicality could really make an impact. So keep an eye on that. I don't necessarily think he's going to play, and I think Troy Brown Jr. is pretty clearly ahead of him in the, we'll call it pecking order, I guess. But keep an eye on it. It's certainly a possibility. All right. I want to talk, Kat, I want to talk a little bit about Rudy Goar and ESPN's way too early awards, which is insanely early. I want to do that next. We'll close the show with the Sixers preview. I'll go a little bit more in depth. I know I just rattled off a couple things, but that was really more specific to the rotation. But my keys to the game, we'll talk about the FanDuel line for this one. So we'll do all of that here next. Today's episode of Locked On Wolves is brought to us by our friends at eBay Motors. Our partners at eBay Motors have teamed up with Locked On Fantasy Basketball host Josh Lloyd to bring you some of the best fantasy picks each week, all season long. Whether you're prepping for a daily draft or just scouting the waiver wire for your season-long league, every week we're going to provide you players that are guaranteed to fit your roster. So let's see who Josh has picked out for us on this week's eBay's Guaranteed Fit Fantasy Picks of the Week, and it's none other than Kyle Anderson is right there on Josh Lloyd's list. With Jaden McDaniels out for a week minimum, Anderson should see a boost in his production to help fantasy managers and across the board. Like, it makes sense to add Kyle Anderson to your team. I mentioned earlier, he is a Swiss Army knife, right? He's going to help you in multiple categories depending on how you're the scoring setup for your league. But he's certainly going to see that minutes boost, and he's going to be a more well-rounded player for you. And whether or not he's starting, he's the guy to add. Josh Lloyd from Locked On Fantasy Basketball is going to help you win your fantasy championship. And eBay Motors knows the championship team is about each player being a perfect fit. It's the exact same with your vehicle. I think we've all had an experience. We've had a car that has been in not great shape, but we've wanted to keep it going. Maybe you've got a dream ride, or just trying to remember a car that you used to have, and you're trying to find that again, right? You're trying to find a car that you truly love. You want to keep running no matter what. With over 122 million parts for your number one ride or die, you can make sure your ride stays running smoothly. Brake kits, LED headlights, roof rack, bumpers, whatever your baby needs, eBay Motors has it. And with eBay Guaranteed Fit, it's guaranteed to fit your ride the first time, every time, or your money back. Plus, at these prices, you're burning rubber, not cash. Keep your ride or die alive at ebaymotors.com. eBay Guaranteed Fit, only available to U.S. customers. Eligible items only. Exclusions apply. Locked On has launched the first ever national sports 24/7 streaming channel on YouTube. Locked On Sports Today is here for you 24/7, covering the top sports stories of the day with the local experts of Locked On. Plus, our national shows covering every league. Go to Locked On Sports Today on YouTube and subscribe to the first ever national sports 24/7 streaming channel. All right, let's continue the let's shift gears into the Karl-Anthony Towns conversation. We're at that point now where Timberwolves fans are willing to pick fights with anybody online, hopefully only, about Cat and how good he's been. And, there's a Bam Adebayo, Karl-Anthony Towns comparison going around on X. We're at that point because Cat has played that well. The crazy thing is he's played every bit as good defensively as he has offensively. And if you dig into some of the advanced metrics, not all of them are necessarily reporting stats yet. Like B-Ball Index doesn't have everything on their site yet. And I don't believe ESPN has the real plus minus going. But for some of the ones you can find, the defensive numbers are impressive for Cat. And I know that the lineup numbers are good with Rudy, and we'll dig into this maybe another day, with Rudy and Ants on the floor and Cat off the floor. That doesn't mean that they're bad with Cat on the floor, because they're not, right? Right now, virtually any metric you can find will tell you Cat's been having his best season so far on the defensive side of the floor. I know we're only 13 games in. Obviously, small sample sizes apply here, but what else do you want me to say? We're 13 games in. So that's the information we have. We can understand the caveats. We'll still celebrate that he's playing so well. And let me just I get it, right? Like, you could take any 13 game sample. You could take March 1st to February 10th. Nope, that's backwards. February 1st to March 10th. And be like, okay, well, in that 13 game stretch, here's how good or how bad he was. I get it, but they still count as much as the next, 69 games or whatever's left in the season. I think that's right. So all that to say, the defense has been every bit as good as the offense. The crazy thing is, offensively, we know he struggled at the very beginning of the season. He's been much better over the past, call it 2 weeks. Sitting here right now, his free throw rate is by far his lowest free throw rate since his rookie season, when obviously he was used much differently, which is crazy, by the way. His rookie year was his lowest three-point attempt rate and his lowest free throw rate. And I'm sure it was because he's being used in the post constantly by Flip Saunders. And that was just kind of what he did his rookie season. It was fine. Like, he was very good as a rookie, but we're obviously not seeing that now. That's going to lead to a lower free throw rate and a lower three-point rate. But sitting here right now, it's his lowest free throw rate since his rookie season and his second lowest three-point attempt rate since we'll just say since he's become a three-point shooting champion, right? What All-Star break was that? 2019? Or was it 2020, right before COVID? One of the two. His first 4 seasons, his three-point attempt rate was always below 30%. But since then, other than 2 years ago, when it was right at 30%, it's been like north of 35%. Right now, this would be his second lowest since 2018, 2019. So he's going to shoot more threes at some point. He's eventually going to get more foul calls. We can only hope. And by the way, we saw the free throw rate tick downward a little bit last year too, but it was super high 2 years ago. It was a career high 0.385, which, if you're not familiar with free throw rate, what that means is he was attempting nearly 0.4 of a free throw for every field goal attempt, which is a really good number, especially for a big, right? And that was his last All-Star season before the injury-riddled year last year. So if he could bring that free throw rate and the three-point attempt rate back up to where we're used to having it, then, I mean, look out, because he's been super good defensively. We've also seen the assist rate go down a ton, and that's mostly because the usage has been lower. He's just had the ball in his hands less because of the way the Wolves offense has been operating. But the last week and a half, the ball's been going through him more often. We saw the 9-assist game the other day, and we know that that's in there for Cat. And if Chris Finch continues to call sets where the ball ends up in his hands, we're going to see that number come back up too. And while the turnover rate's also at its lowest since 2017-18, his first All-Star season, that will come back up the more he has the ball in his hands. And we saw that last year when he had a career, or not a career high, but a really high assist rate and a high turnover rate. But it was palatable because I don't actually think the turnovers last year were necessarily a function of him passing the ball crazy. I think he's improved that a lot over the last 2 seasons. I think it was more the offensive fouls, right? And this year in general, we've seen the offensive fouls come down. We've seen the terrible passes come down. It's just been a more well-rounded Karl-Anthony Towns. There's no question about it. But the point here is he can shoot more threes and get to the line more without those issues coming back. And of course, there's a perfect balance there with Cat of not being overly aggressive offensively, picking up those offensive fouls as he's trying to get to the line. But as long as he's not hooking guys and which is usually his problem, or just straight running guys over, we saw at the end of the Pelicans game when he sidestepped the defender trying to take a charge in the final 6 seconds of the game. He's improved in those areas, and he could keep doing that while shooting more threes and getting to the line more often. And that to me is really exciting, that he's really only scratching the surface within this Wolves offense. He's on track to easily play, his best season since, he was really good 2 years ago, but getting back to the true all-star levels on offense of, call it 5 years ago, pre-COVID, right? That's still in there for Karl-Anthony Towns. And it should be easier to unlock because you have Anthony Edwards. And I do think we're finding that correct balance. And we could have that argument about and actually, I think we're talking about it on the Locked On Sports Minnesota basketball party. Who's been the better player this year? It's a fool's argument to try to argue between Towns and Anthony Edwards, but that's something that nationally there's going to be that conversation, right? Which actually is not a bad segue. ESPN has these way too early awards, way too early end of season awards, which is absurd because we're 15% of the way through the season, not quite for most teams. And they talk about MVP, they talk about Rookie of the Year, things that aren't necessarily going to involve the Wolves. But my segue point there is there's actually a mention of Anthony Edwards for MVP as somebody to consider. And I just think that's crazy. Like, I get that he's making a jump. Actually, he's mentioned twice, 2 different people. Tim Bontemps mentions Edwards, and so does Ramona Shelburne as having a resume to make a strong case for MVP through 13 games. I think that's very aggressive because this team is so deep, and Anthony Edwards has been great. Don't get me wrong, but his production is not necessarily the sole reason why the Wolves are 10-3 coming into this game against the Sixers on Wednesday night. I think the MVP thing is aggressive at this point, in part because Karl-Anthony Towns has been so good. And I know there's precedent for, great players winning MVPs on the same team as other great players. I get that happens. But I just there's other, I don't know. I don't want to turn this into Edwards is overrated, because I'm not saying that at all. I'm just saying, let's hang on, because Karl-Anthony Towns has been every bit as good as Anthony Edwards if you take the body of work over the last 13 games. There's no question about that. The thing I wanted to point out was the way too early pick for Defensive Player of the Year. Both Kevin Pelton and Tim Bontemps mentioned Rudy Gobert as who should win it through 13 games. But Pelton, of course, very analytically minded, points out, among the players who have defended at least 4 shots per game inside 5 feet, only the Hornets' Nick Richards has held opponents to a lower percentage than Gobert's 49%. He's holding opponents to 49% inside 5 feet. That's according to Second Spectrum tracking on NBA Advanced Stats. And Gobert's rebounding is a key factor in Minnesota ranking in the top 10 of the defensive glass for the first time in a decade. That's according to Pelton. Bontemps says basically the same thing. He says Gobert physically looks like a different player than he did last season, and the results have followed. I concur with all that. I think it's incredible he's getting that attention. For the most part, it's been a very high-level masterclass in defense coming from Rudy Gobert. And we'll see, without Jaden McDaniels here for the next 2 to possibly 3 weeks, what that looks like for the Wolves defense. I don't necessarily think it's going to impact Gobert that much. In theory, there could be a couple more straight line drives per game that end up reaching Gobert, and he's got to be a little bit more involved. But I think Gobert is the true anchor of this defense. For as good as McDaniels is on the perimeter, Gobert has been so good. And what did I say when the Wolves traded for him last summer? He's a walking top 10 defense, right? This team will maintain likely a top 5 defense in the time that McDaniels is out. And McDaniels just takes them from extremely good to great defensively would be my take on that. And we'll see how Alexander Walker, how Ant, and the likes of even Shake Milton and Troy Brown Jr., how these guys hold up on the perimeter in the absence of McDaniels. All right, I want to close the show here today by talking Wolves-Sixers. My keys to the game. We'll talk about the FanDuel line, which surprised me what that line is coming into this game. We'll do all that here next. And speaking of FanDuel, you can score early this NFL season with FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. Right now, new customers at FanDuel get $150 in bonus bets with any winning $5 moneyline bet. That's $150 if your team wins. And if you've been thinking about joining FanDuel, there's no better time to get in on the action, especially this week. Tomorrow is Thanksgiving. There's football all day, three NFL games, and of course, no basketball, but you get basketball tonight. You get basketball Friday. Plus, you have the prime NFL game on Friday as well. The first ever Black Friday NFL game following Thanksgiving. And of course, college football, the last regular week of college football is this Saturday. So Thursday, Friday, Saturday, you get NFL Thursday on Thanksgiving. You get NFL plus NBA Friday. And then you've got NBA and college football all day Saturday. And then, of course, NFL Sunday. It's a huge weekend for sports. It's the perfect time to get on FanDuel. The app is really easy to use. There's a wide range of betting options, including spreads, player props, over-unders, and more. We'll talk about the FanDuel line for the Wolves game next on the show. Visit FanDuel.com/lockedon to continue your NFL season and an exciting week of sports. FanDuel, official partner of the NFL. All right, let's talk Wolves-Sixers. Let's get right into my keys for this game. I listed a couple of these kind of in passing at the beginning of the show, talking about the rotation, sans Jaden McDaniels. Number one is defending without fouling. And to me, that is probably the most important thing. And the Wolves actually have done, the body of work has been good so far this year in terms of avoiding fouling. The Wolves are still, fifth in the league in opponent free throw attempts per field goal attempts, which is a really good mark. They're top five. It doesn't feel that way, though, because the last handful of games, and we'll just say the road trip and actually plus the game on Monday night against New York, the Wolves have kind of backslid into what they did last year in terms of foul trouble. We've seen Cat in foul trouble. We've seen Ant in foul trouble. We've seen McDaniels in foul trouble. And what the Sixers do best is draw fouls. The Sixers are, I lost my number here, but they are number 3 in offensive free throw rate so far this season in the NBA. So that's what they do. Even without James Harden, the Sixers are still getting to the line at a crazy clip, and they've got a great offense. The Sixers so far this season have the number 3 offense in terms of offensive rating, according to Basketball Reference, and they're number 3 in free throw rate as well. And I said earlier, they don't shoot a ton of threes. So I think we could see a little bit more zone from the Wolves. I think we could just see the strategy shift a little, especially no McDaniels. Try and make them into a jump shooting team. Try to avoid getting into foul trouble, because that's where you're going to have trouble making it up on the other end of the floor. So defending without fouling is number 1 for me. Number 2, defensive rebound. And these are 2 things that, like, all last year I could have been listing as keys to the game. But the Sixers are a good offensive rebounding team as well. They are number 9 in offensive rebound rate, and they're more middle of the pack in terms of defensive rebounding, but they get some cheap buckets on the offensive glass. Joel Embiid being chief among those. I mean, Kelly Oubre is a good offensive rebounder. Of course, he's out after the accident from a couple of weeks ago. There's some other kind of sneaky good rebounders on this team. I mean, Robert Covington, old friend Rocco, is averaging a offensive rebound and a half per game in 15 minutes off the bench. That's a pretty significant rebound rate. Paul Reed, kind of the same deal. So the Wolves need to be cognizant of some of these wings sneaking in and grabbing rebounds. Of course, putting a body on Embiid. That's always in the game plan, in the must-dos coming into a game against the Sixers. But defensive rebounding is going to be key. That's another area that the Wolves were really good the first 10, 11 games of the season, and have kind of backslid here more recently. So the Wolves must be better on the defensive glass in this game than they have been of late. The last thing is playing fast and forcing the issue. We've seen the Wolves kind of get lulled into playing slow at times. For the season, the Wolves are only 18th in pace. They've been too comfortable to walk the ball up the court. And it's more palatable because the defense has been so good, and you're getting, but that's also what's so crazy. I talked about this maybe a week ago. I pulled the cleaning the glass numbers. The Wolves have not been opportunistic enough in transition for as many defensive boards as they rip down off of opponent missed shots, because they're forcing so many misses. They still lead the league in opponent effective field goal percentage. The Wolves need to get out in transition more often and just be more aggressive in transition. They need to do that in this game against the Sixers. They need to force the issue against Philadelphia. Philadelphia's got their defense overall is what? They're 12th in the league, so they've got a good defense. They actually play at a slightly faster pace than the Wolves, but I think Minnesota, outside of Tyrese Maxey, like, who on that team is really wanting to play fast? And obviously Maxey's a huge issue you have to deal with, But the Wolves should be forcing the issue, and maybe McDaniels not playing hurts you a little bit there. But I would say Alexander Walker is a better spot-up three-point shooter in transition. Like, it only hurts you in that you're probably not turning the opponent over quite as much without McDaniels on the floor. But the Wolves just really need to force the issue. They need to play fast whenever possible and try and avoid going against the set defense. The Wolves have the athletes. They have the shooters to do it. So that's what I want to see them do in this game. All right, last thing, the FanDuel betting line for this evening's game. Believe it or not, your Minnesota Timberwolves are a 4.5-point favorite at home against the Sixers. Now, Philly played on Tuesday night. They lost an overtime game to the Cavs. That was an in-season tournament game. So they're actually 2-2 in the in-season tournament. And so, Philly's traveling in from Philadelphia on a back-to-back after an overtime game. So all that benefits the Wolves. They had 4 of 5 starters play more than 40 minutes in this game. So that's, and of course, the Wolves are 6-0 at home, right? So that's how you get the 4.5-point spread. I was a little bit surprised. I thought it would be more like 2.5 or 3. But here we are, 4.5 points, over under of 219.5 points. I feel like that line is just a tad high. But the Wolves are getting the respect that good teams get at home, rest advantage, even no McDaniels though. Like it's incredible. So Philly playing last night is significant. Playing in overtime is significant. They're also 1-1 so far this season in back-to-backs. They beat Portland way back at the end of October on the second night of a back-to-back, and then they lost to Boston on the heels of a loss. So about a week ago, they lost to the Pacers in an in-season tournament game. The next day, they lost to Boston, which is an understandable, we'll call it a schedule loss, on a back-to-back against one of the best teams in the league. Since then, they won at Atlanta, at Brooklyn, 2 very winnable games for this team, and then lost at home to the Cavs in overtime last night. So, I mean, you look at who they've beaten, like, other than beating, splitting games with the Pacers, they did beat Boston at home once, and they beat Phoenix back when Phoenix was really struggling. It's not like they've beaten a whole ton of great teams. They've lost to Milwaukee, they've lost to Indiana, they've lost to Boston, and now they've lost to the Cavs. So it's understandable. The Wolves should be favored in this game. I was just surprised the line, the spread is as great as it is at 4.5 over at FanDuel. But this should be a fun game. And we'll, of course, have the Locked On Wolves postcast, which will be live on the Locked On Sports Minnesota YouTube channel. I believe it'll be Luke Inman hosting with Tyler Metcalf from Canis Hoopus again this evening. They do a great job. Check that out at Locked On Sports Minnesota tonight. And then you can also listen to it on this feed. The next episode after this one is going to be the basketball party that I do with a bunch of the guys over at Locked On Sports Minnesota, including Jack Borman from Canis Hoopus, Sam Ekstrom, Locked On Sports Minnesota, Ron Johnson, and Reggie Wilson from Care 11. And then the episode after that will be the postcast. And then I'll be back on Thursday for which is Thanksgiving. But Thursday morning, you will have a podcast in your feed, the postgame podcast, talking Wolves-Sixers from Wednesday night. So this is Wednesday, Thursday. There's tons of stuff coming at you in the Locked On Wolves feed. You get this show, my Wednesday show. You get the basketball party. You get the live postcast after the game. And then you'll get my show again tomorrow morning as the post-game pod following Wolves-Sixers. So a packed couple of days. Hopefully you have a fantastic holiday as well. And if you're out and about tonight, or you're doing whatever, prepping in the kitchen, and you're not watching the game, listen to the game on SiriusXM. Check out the Hometown Call with Alan Horton. You'll hear Wolves-Sixers tonight at 7 Central. Catch every bucket of the Hometown broadcast on SiriusXM on the SXM app. Just search Minnesota Timberwolves on the SXM app, and you will find Alan Horton on the call. Wolves-Sixers tonight. All right, that's all we have for you today. Thank you for making Locked On Wolves your first listen every day. Of course, this show is free and available everywhere, including YouTube, as well as all of your favorite audio platforms. You can also watch on the Locked On Sports Minnesota app on Roku and Amazon Fire TV, and you can follow on X at Locked On T-Wolves and also at Beecken with 2 B's, 2 E's, C-K-E-N. Of course, the Locked On Wolves podcast is part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Remember, the Locked On Network is your local experts on all the biggest stories. Once again, I'm Ben Beecken. This is the Locked On Wolves podcast, and we'll catch you next time.